A spike in inmate violence, inmate deaths, and the prison director's response. Obamacare and Arkansas. What will some executive orders change? The war on coal, was it already over? And the president, how much of the right does he still command, and where? Arkansas Week, next.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. In the next half hour, prisons, health care, maybe tax policy, and certainly GOP strength in Arkansas and the nation. Heather Yates joins us. She's from UCA, where she is a professor of political science, and of course, Michael Hiblin, reporter and news director for KUAR Public Radio in Central Arkansas. Michael, we'll start with you. The director of the Arkansas Department of Correction before the General Assembly this week, and the subject, mostly what appears to be a spike, indisputably a spike in violent incidents involving inmates. Some of that violence directed against guards, correctional officers, some of it against other inmates.
Yeah, we've had a lot of violence at the state prisons, the maximum security facilities, and the governor, after one incident last month where you had separate incidents occur at both of the maximum security prisons, said that we need to get a plan to respond to this. So this week on Wednesday, Wendy Kelly, the director of the Department of Correction, went before a panel of state lawmakers to talk about what can be done, what has put the state in this situation. And there quite a few variables in this. Number one, there is overcrowding. I think the corrections system was designed for about 16,200 inmates. You've got, or that's actually the population now. It was designed for about 15,300. You also have officials say a lot more gang violence going on in prisons, and there's a lot of turnover with the correctional officers. There's been an increase in pay that went into effect this summer as part of an overall state employee salary increase. And the Wendy Kelly said that has helped. They have gotten more people applying, but there's such a big turnover rate as well. It's not a very desirable job for a lot of reasons. It's also not in central urban areas. These prisons obviously are out in the middle of nowhere, places they've been largely for a century or more. But these incidents, you've had a lot of correctional officers, you've had inmates hospitalized. So the Department of Correction has come up with Plan 3 real approaches they're going to take. Number one, increase security equipment, including the fencing. You've got situations where the maximum security inmates have been able to get through fences, and they're still within the correctional facility, but they're then able to run around. And you've had, in particular, the incident last month where they had to fire warning shots and had to use some chemical disbursements. And you've had the Department of Corrections saying we need to improve security. And I know from my time covering executions, you go into these prisons, they still look pretty old in terms of the security. Even the security cameras, the gates, whatnot, they need to improve those. They need to add more housing for especially troublesome inmates, more restrictive housing rather than the large barracks housing that you have. They also want to create controlled access points to the maximum security areas.
If that be the action plan, as it were, how fast can they start moving on this? They've already increased correctional officer salary.
Yeah, that's they say they want to move as quick as they can. They don't know yet exactly how much it'll cost, but say they believe that can be offset, that they can, at this point, at least start taking steps. They may have to go to the legislature at some point for a more long-term plan. But there were some, in particular, State Senator Joyce Elliott at Wednesday's hearing, who weren't very impressed by this. There have been issues like for some of these incidents that have occurred at the prisons. It wasn't reported to Arkansas State Police right away. In some cases, you've had attacks on inmates or guards that weren't followed up on for several days or a week or more. And there are just a lot of issues that she said really left her unimpressed. The fact that sometimes people who have loved ones in prison are left wondering what's the status of their relatives, saying that the Department of Correction isn't as responsive there. So there's a whole lot that needs to be addressed. It will take time, but this at least is the beginning of the process, and Governor Asa Hutchinson said he is at least encouraged by what he's heard at this point.
One of the most arresting, no pun intended, one of the most arresting things that came out from this here and from previous coverage of the ADC was contraband, cell phones, but particularly a high-risk illegal drug.
Yeah, K2, this synthetic form of marijuana. The Arkansas Times had a big report talking about how in some cases it suggests that guards are even, involved. And it's always been an issue of contraband getting into prisons, but that this K2, it's hard to detect. It's potentially deadly, and that in particular has been a key concern for a lot of people. And it also can make people rather volatile. So there are concerns like that, and how do you actually crack down and effectively go after problems like that?
Yeah. Heather?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's also going to be a problem too in terms of we've not the word ignited, but it spurs this federal relationship, right? How is the governor going to manage these things? And because these are state issues, right? And this is where at the federal level they want them to be state issues. And how are they going to transgress, and how are, regions going to impact one another? And this is also on capital punishment. How does capital punishment in Arkansas affect what's happening in Oklahoma and vice versa? Because we saw that in the spring. So there are also some complicating factors with the relationship between local authorities, the governor. The governor would very much rather have these issues, solved at the local level, but there's also some sort of need for a legislative intervention possibly. And with what we've seen Arkansas have to grapple with at the national level this spring with the death penalty drug cocktail, this is something that has invoked necessarily cooperative relationship between local authorities and the governor. And the local authorities need to look to their constitutional officers for cues on how to solve some of these problems as well. So there's that power sharing dynamic too that, for better or for worse, is activated and pivots around some of these problems that have to be solved at the local level.
Yeah, and Michael, at these hearings at which Director Kelly appeared, there was some discussion about, and always is, about the still ever increasing rate of incarceration, maybe not the rate, but the ever increasing inmate population in the system. One of the maybe the highest on a per capita basis in the country. Any progress being made on that? Any near-term solution to that?
I don't know if anything has, it could actually pass at this point, but that too was brought up Wednesday, that, maybe these are offenses, especially drug crimes, that can be treated without necessarily long-term prison sentences. That has been an issue, for decades, but are there ways you can offer treatment rather than incarceration for nonviolent drug addicts?
And, I'm sorry.
It just, it's just it's a tough situation, but with the staffing, there were even talks that if you had more of these positions filled that are vacant, you wouldn't have, and you had, say, more searches, you wouldn't have these improvised weapons that sometimes have been used to attack guards. So officials, it's a tough challenge for the state to grapple with, but the hope is, at least with what's been suggested, maybe this is a starting place for these latest incidents.
Yeah, and on the subject of executions, as we speak, still pending is litigation regarding disclosure of the source of the drugs that Arkansas uses in the cocktail, as it were, in executions, and we have a capital case due for execution early next month in November.
Yeah, Jack Green scheduled to be executed on November 9th. There are a couple of appeals still in the works. On Thursday, the Arkansas Supreme Court said it will not hear oral arguments on a challenge to the state not releasing the label and package inserts for one of the 3 lethal injection drugs, midazolam. In the past, this attorney has been successful in forcing the state to getting courts to force the state to release these package inserts, and reporters are usually then able to use these to determine the source, the drug maker of this. The legislature, of course, a few years ago, had been effective in passing a law that said you don't have to release the source where these drugs came from, but when these package inserts are released, they can then be traced back to the supplier or the drug maker, and that's when you get the drug companies unhappy about their product being used in an execution. So we won't have oral arguments heard on that appeal. The justices will just make a decision based on the documents that have been filed with the court, and that obviously will be probably coming here in the next week or so, with only a few weeks left before this execution. You also had the Attorney General's office on Tuesday file paperwork arguing that Jefferson County judge does not have the authority to stay Jack Green's execution. Green is asking for a hearing to talk about his mental competency. The Attorney General, Leslie Rutledge, says that's been argued in the past, that it's already been decided that that shouldn't halt his execution. We also had a few weeks ago, or maybe I guess it was about a week or two ago, the State Parole Board have a hearing, and they got some pretty emotional testimony from relatives of the man that Jack Green was convicted of killing, brutal killing, and arguing the death sentence needs to be carried out. And in the end, the parole board decided to recommend the governor not reduce his sentence to life in prison, suggests the governor go ahead and keep this execution on track as scheduled.
Moving on. They weren't all executive orders per se, but particularly two, Heather, decisions in the White House seem to turn health care, or have the potential anyway. This thing may be protracted, and they don't always unfold exactly the way the administration indicates they will. But that said, if fully enacted or carried out, the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was turned on its head.
Parts of it, right? Because these executive orders, or at least one that had multiple parts to it, and then there's been subsequent announcements from the White House about other aspects that the Trump White House is torpedoing. And so he is the president, systematically trying to dismantle some of the infrastructure. Right now, as we sit here, the Obamacare plan, healthcare infrastructure remains intact, but what these executive orders have done are a couple of things. The first peels back some of the regulation of the insurance market that would enable the market then, or what it does is it peels back those regulations, enabling insurance providers to provide lower premiums but not as much coverage, and work around some of those regulations that were instituted by the Obamacare era rules. And then the second announcement that followed that first executive order that has just been released within the last 24 hours, but last night, a further extension of that was to declare illegal the financial supplements that the federal government paid to low-income families that would help them defray costs of their insurance premiums. And it was issued last night. I believe it was a media statement from the White House press secretary that indicated that the White House and the president had determined, with the analysis of the agencies, the cooperating agencies, that those payments are illegal. So how does this impact Arkansas? So the protracted impact, which we would see if these hold, take effect as soon as 2018 and most certainly in 2019. So the hardest hit is going to be the rural low-income family. And what this does to what Asa Hutchinson expanded, the Obamacare program with the Medicare extensions, that is also Medicaid, excuse me, thank you. Medicaid rollout, how that is impacted remains to be seen because of what Donald Trump's added commentary to the EOs. But so that possibly creates a headache for the governor, right? Because is Arkansas going to absorb costs? Is Arkansas going to have a more competitive market? Which, by the way, I also want to say that it is almost a superficial narrative attached to this executive order that by peeling back some of these Obama-era regulations, that creates more of a competitive marketplace and where insurance companies can compete across state lines. And if we remember, over the last several years, this was one of the primary points of contention that the Republican Party said that it killed marketplace competition because insurers could not compete across state lines. So the narrative here is that the EO removes that stipulation, but early analysis, hours new analysis, so this stands to change, says that insurers could actually leave the market now because of the influx of what's called junk insurance plans. Lower premiums, short-term costs to the consumer looks great, but it's lower coverage and fewer consumer protections.
As long as you don't have a car wreck, a serious car wreck, it's good stuff.
As long as you don't have anything catastrophic happen, yeah, you're fine. But in the event that you have something catastrophic, you need a life flight, you need an ambulance, you need an ER visit, you don't have the coverage and you don't have the consumer protections.
We know that Mr. Hutchinson already has an appeal file or a request pending for a waiver to shrink the pool in Arkansas, all right, or reduce the poverty level from, or cut back the coverage from 138% back to 100%, which would eliminate some 60,000, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes.
From Medicare.
Right, and that
from the expansion, yeah.
Right. So in Arkansas, we have, either way you look at it, we have a problem of increasing the number of uninsured residents in this state, and that, any way you look at it, is a big problem because right now Obamacare made it possible for so many people to receive coverage, even if the recipient of that coverage was not necessarily a supporter of the program, was receiving benefits of that program. And so we have a potentially very real problem on our hands, and other states comparatively with larger populations have this problem of associated costs with uninsured consumers, uninsured patients, and that puts not drives a cost, but it puts an incredible strain on state budgets, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, the subsidy, the end of the subsidy payments, which Mr. Trump directed on Thursday night, that was a real blow to the program.
Right.
And in fairness to the administration, and even some Democrats would acknowledge, there's litigation still pending on that, as to the legality, the very constitutionality of those payments.
Right,
subsidies.
Right, because it hasn't even worked its way through the litigation procedure to even be declared illegal. But here we have the president taking a political position, okay, saying that these payments are illegal without any legal opinion, a judge weighing in on whether or not this is blurring lines or overreach of a federal agency, and so it's trying to preempt litigation as a way of indirect pressuring, and whether that's successful or not remains to be seen, and this all has to play out. But what we're looking in terms of short-term cost is to the consumer looking for more manageable health care. When they see the price tag, they're going to be duped into thinking that alleviates their burden. But long-term costs, we're looking at the consumer, the patient, and at the state, is we're going to have to either absorb these costs or regulate the industry to control their costs in some capacity, and there's yet no infrastructure in place to handle that.
The administration, Michael, this past week through the EPA declared the war on coal over. Saw that one coming.
Yeah, this wasn't a surprise. I think the president had said in March in an executive order took the first step in cutting back the President Obama's Clean Power Plan. And this week, the head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt, who was one of the attorneys general nationwide who had challenged the Clean Power Plan, along with the Arkansas Attorney General, he formally announced steps to dismantle the Clean Power Plan. And what this will mean at this point is that you won't have the mandates for the reduction in carbon emissions from power plants as had been expected, but environmental groups are responding that the train has already left the station, that you've got the utility companies who have already been taking steps in recent years to move away from coal. And it's been played as a war on coal, but to a large degree, experts have said, well, a lot of this has to do with the low cost of natural gas. Right. And you have had utilities making investments in solar, in wind, and in Arkansas, Entergy in particular, had said a year or two back that it would begin phasing out or even closing two of its power plants in Arkansas, the White Bluff plant near Redfield and the Independence plant in Newark. And we've, when the first executive order came out back in March, I talked with Entergy, and even still, they and the other power companies around the state are giving a lot of specifics about what their response will be, saying that they're already moving toward cleaner energy and that they don't expect to change the direction they're moving, but they're not putting out a lot of specifics, saying they're still kind of evaluating the situation. So you get the impression there's still talks going on about what's the best way for these entities to move forward, as corporations, what's in their best interest, how to respond. But the key is that at this point, you've got these rules that are being kind of retracted, and we'll see actually what plays out.
Okay. Heather, you've been doing some research, and a lot of people have, in fact. Mr. Trump has never been above, I don't think, 40% since taking office. But his base, that he seems so intent, any politician with his base seems so intent on maintaining that, a little disenchanted around the edges anyway. Mm-hmm. But in some regions anyway, he still has deep pockets.
Yeah, deep pockets of support. And Arkansas is one of those deep pockets. Arkansas remains Trump country. And I am not alone in studying this effect of the aggregate polls versus what's happening at the state level. There's a cadre of us out there keeping our eyes on what's happening in popularity of this presidency. But with regard to how Arkansas is impacting this terrain is in January when he took office, the support for the president was at 59%. As of September, that has not wavered very much. It's at 54.4%. And what we see in Arkansas, which is kind of unconventional with national trends, is in national trends, we're seeing rural areas, rural counties, rural districts losing a little bit of faith in this current administration. In Arkansas, it's the opposite. We actually have a very strong Trump supporting base in rural Arkansas. So, and this is also being mirrored in neighboring states. It's the mountain state regions and it's the swath of southern states that we're seeing this counter trend to the national trend. So Arkansas very still in the red column for Trump. This stands to possibly help the midterm elections for the House delegation. We don't have any senators up for re-election this go around, so I don't think any of our incumbent senators are going to be drawing any challengers anytime soon, especially with Tom Cotton being a very pro-Trump advocate in D.C. So how this looks in Arkansas, we're going to be a solid red state, I think, for the next few years.
Well,
through the midterm.
on the hard right, Mr. Bannon and some of his associates this past week declared war on rhinos or anybody they perceive to be a soft Republican. Mm-hmm. And we had this past week a balloon anyway from a young woman in Hot Springs,
right,
who is exploring the possibility of challenging from the right Mr. Hutchinson in the primary.
Right. So she announced early this week that she's creating a an exploratory committee, and it's just that, an exploratory committee to travel the state to explore the possibilities of waging a a realistic competitive challenge. In Arkansas, given this data, I don't see this being a realistic challenge because Asa Hutchinson is a popular governor. He is not a vulnerable incumbent. As of, I think it was July, he was in the top 10 most popular governors, hovering around 60% popularity here in Arkansas and through national perception. And so I don't think Asa Hutchinson meets the definition of a Republican in name only among local residents, and seems to not nationally as well. And coming off of the Republican runoff in Alabama, this war declared on these soft Republicans, moderates, is encouraging people to self-select in, and I very much interpret this kind of proto-challenge to Asa Hutchinson as a self-selected recruitment to try to challenge him from the extreme far right.
Yeah, Michael, I don't see anybody demanding Mr. Hutchinson's head. He's
No.
delivered, whether you approve or not, he's delivered on just about everything he...
Yeah, but compared to a lot of Republicans, he has been fairly moderate. He, has worked with Democrats, and I think probably has looked out for the best interests of his state rather than strict party alliance. This candidate, Jan Morgan, she really rose to fame and became a regular on cable TV shows through her announcement that the gun range she owns would be Muslim-free zone, that she did not feel comfortable allowing Muslims to learn to use a gun at her facility. So she's not the typical candidate you would see coming up. It's not a state lawmaker, anyone who's worked their way, through the normal political channels, especially if you're going to make a statewide challenge to an office. But she announced she's forming this exploratory committee. She said she would be announcing her candidacy on the Fox Business Channel, and I watched her appearance, I think it was Tuesday night, and there was no mention of her candidacy at all. It was strictly her talking about her opinion on bump stocks, this device that allows weapons to be modified to fire like automatic weapons, and it was that was all this was about. So I don't think even from one of these programs that's using her regularly, there was a talk about serious politics on it, just another commentator to talk about guns.
Got to end it there because we're out of time. Thanks for coming in. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.